Hi guys, and welcome back to the video. This is a different kind of video today, with the next gen right around the corner, literally days away at the date of this video. I want to talk about some of the things that you should be thinking about before you pick up one of your shiny new next gen console of choice. That's assuming you manage to get a pre-order or manage to snag a release day unit. So I'm briefly going to go over the storage for the consoles, which seems to be something that people are having an issue with, and also the additional hardware you might be needing to buy before you think about your console being the next gen console it is. So I'll kind of explain that as I get there. So first we'll go over storage. One of the things that people have been saying and kind of that we've seen online with reviews and such is that these consoles don't have that much memory. That's SSD memory sort of on the devices, but this is actually not that big a problem because the SSDs are really only meant to be storing the new next gen titles. So as though they don't seem to be showing it in videos, which is kind of like, they might have shown it earlier on, but I don't think they've been kind of hyping up when it's come to reviews. If you have an external USB SSD, it's pretty much a few seconds slower than if you ran from the internal one. So it's not a huge difference. So if you're running your backwards compatibility games from these external SSDs, you actually aren't going to notice that much of a difference in loading times between transferring it onto the internal drives. You might like lose like 4 or 5 seconds here or there, but it's not going to be enough for you to basically have to shift them backwards and forwards. And that's because the interfaces on the new consoles to their like USB ports are so much faster and not bottlenecked by the processor as the old consoles like the Xbox One and the PS4 Pro were. So you literally can just like run those games off of the external SSD, and maybe a game that loaded in 10 seconds on the internal will load in like 15 seconds on the external. So I wouldn't worry about that too much. And I'm kind of surprised that a lot of sort of like streamers and stuff haven't really been mentioning that, because basically what you're doing is worrying people who think that they're going to end up like taking up all their space and then having to transfer games backwards and forwards, but you actually don't. The internal drive, when it's loading backwards compatibility games, simply isn't that much faster than an external one. It literally isn't. What they've been basically comparing it to is the old console compared to the internal storage of the new console, when what they should have been doing was the old console compared to external storage on the new console. So an external drive in the old console to an external drive on the new console if they're both SSDs, and then seeing the difference in load times there, and the differences are dramatic. So as I say, the best thing to do with your backwards compatibility library is to not worry about putting it on internal, to just stick it on external and like use it from there, and you'll be fine. If there's one game or two games in particular that you absolutely play all the time, then maybe, just maybe, it might be worth moving those to the internal for convenience. But certainly if they're not games that you're kind of always playing and you're chopping and changing between games, then don't waste your time kind of copying them backwards and forwards. Save that space for something like Assassin's Creed Valhalla, Demon's Souls on the PS5, or Watch Dogs Legion. Save it for something like that, which can actually kind of then sit on your hard drive until you finish playing it, and it has all the new bells and whistles that the consoles can have. So it's gonna probably benefit from just having like the extra speed because of the large textures, etc. But certainly for your backwards compatibility stuff, you don't need to worry about it. I can't stress that enough. Get yourself a good external SSD and you can literally run the backwards compatible games off that, and the load times will still be dramatically faster than they are now on your old console. So that's pretty much what I'm going to cover with that. As I say, don't let people worry about it, just get that if you can. And if you've got an external SSD, note I didn't say an external hard drive, that won't help you. It's got to be an SSD, and then you'll notice dramatic improvements to loading. Next, the other topic that I really wanted to go over was to do with TVs, monitors, sort of basically what you're going to be viewing your games on for next generation. Now, one of the things that a lot of people seem to think is that you're going to need a 4K 120Hz screen. That's not the case. It really isn't. If your TV can do 4K 60 and then do 1080p 120, you're pretty much set for the next generation. There will be some games that will use 4K 120, but they're not going to be games that are like visually like amazing. You'll see something like the Falconeer on the Xbox Series X, which does do that, and you'll also see Ori, Will-o'-the-Wisps, things like that. Those games do look great, but they also look great at 4K 60. They also play fine at 1440p 120. They also play fine at 1080p 120. And that's kind of more where the general games you see are going to be hitting 120. They're going to be in, you know, like the 1440p range or the 1080p range when they hit that. For the games that are looking like Assassin's Creed Valhalla or like I don't know, Dark Souls or Demon Souls, those games, if they hit 4K, the max they're going to be doing is 4K 60. So that's going to be true for kind of like the next year or so, certainly until we get stuff in place for consoles, which is basically the equivalent of Nvidia's DLSS, where you've got upscaling of the textures and you've got super sampling so that your 2K texture looks like a 4K texture, that kind of thing, and then you can upscale that resolution to 4K 60. So in reality it's running at like, what, 1440p 60, and then you've upscaled it to 4K and use super sampling so that no one notices the real difference with the graphics. That's where things are heading, and that's kind of what you're going to see. But until then, you're literally not going to have anything that looks amazing in 4K 120, if anything at all, that you're going to want to get in 4K 120. And even the Falconeer, you know, you can downscale that to 1440p 120 if you want to, and it's still exactly the same game, and you're not going to notice the difference. What you will notice a difference with is a jump from 30 to 60 frames per second. The smoothness there is basically what you absolutely need. So your TV at a minimum is why I'm saying it needs to support 4K 60. The good news is that pretty much every TV in the last, 5-6 years has the option to do 4K 60. Certainly all the LG screens, the Sony screens, the Samsung screens, all of those kind of like the latest ones in the last 5 years or so will support 4K 60. I mean, they've supported it for a while. HDMI 2.0B supports it, you know, so as long as you've got a TV which is fairly recent, get in your next gen console, you're not going to feel anything really dramatic by not having 4K 120 at the start. And then when you next upgrade your screen in, say, a year's time, 2 years time, that's when you're basically going to end up with 4K 120 anyway, because HDMI 2.1 will be the standard. So that's the other thing I wanted to cover. Don't worry too much about your screen. The only issue I can see is that Sony for some reason don't support 1440p, but they never have, so I'm not sure that's too much of an issue for anyone who's like a Sony fan. The only people it really affects is if you have like your console on your desk, and say you've got your PC on there and you've got your console on there and your monitor happens to be 1440p. In that case, most monitors will downscale from whatever, or upscale, or just use 1080p and upscale it. But that's probably the only time you might have an issue, and that's down to Sony to patch in. I don't know why they don't support the lower resolution. I mean, Xbox has supported it forever, and hardly anyone uses an Xbox at 1440p, but they've done it anyway. So I think Sony just kind of needs to follow suit on that. The only other thing that you might want would be I don't know, VRR, I guess, but that's not going to be an essential. What it will do is stop stuttering in some games, but then quite frankly, on the current hardware, PS5, Xbox Series X, if someone's managed to program in stuttering, I would have a hard time forgiving them for that, because they've got enough power to make sure that they don't do that, even if they've got like dynamic scaling in place on the game. So as I said, don't worry too much about upscaling your TV, upgrading it to whatever. You don't need to. If you've bought a TV in the last 5 years, you've got enough horsepower there in the TV to support 4K 60, and you've got your next gen starting right there. It'll look great. The 60 frames per second is really going to feel better. Low latency sort of inputs that both consoles try to support, you'll notice that virtually immediately. So that's kind of really what I wanted to do on that point. So don't worry about it. Don't let anyone scare you into like rushing out and like spending $1,500 after spending $500 on a console just to get a TV that you didn't need or you don't need yet. So that will be my takeaway from that. hopefully that's been kind of useful to you and put your mind at ease somewhat. So the takeaways from this should be: get yourself a nice external USB SSD for your like backwards compatible games. They'll run faster and load faster on the new consoles anyway. The SSDs will work a lot faster on the new consoles than they do on the current consoles, so you'll immediately notice a difference. There's only a few seconds difference in the loading time, simply because the SSDs are going to put max throughput through that USB port, and it'll be fine. Second takeaway: don't bother upgrading your TV if it can handle 4K 60. If it can handle 4K 60, you're set. There won't be any next gen games for the next year or so that will even bother to try and tickle 4K 120 unless they're little games like the Falconeer, Ori, and even then you can play those at 4K 60 and you'll notice dramatic improvement. The image quality is going to be absolutely amazing at 4K, as long as your screen's big enough or you're sitting close enough. You do one or the other, basically. That's kind of how TVs work. If you want to see the difference, you either need to be sitting close enough or your screen needs to be big enough for you to see it. But that's kind of, that depends on what TV you bought. I've got no control over that. But yeah, that's the takeaway. I hope this has been helpful to you. As always, have a great time out there. Stay safe and look after one another.